This beginner-friendly tutorial will show you how to make an India ink landscape. If you love learning about art, subscribe and support this public school teacher's side hustle. Find me on Instagram or TikTok at thatartteacher_Machado. I will put all of my materials in the description box, and I'm going to start by using artist tape, but I have trust issues, so I always put it on an article of clothing first so it doesn't rip my paper. And for this, I'm using watercolor paper, and I also love to use a smooth Bristol when doing these monochromatic landscapes. I love taping the edges because it gives you a beautiful, crisp, white frame when you're done with it. It just makes it look finished, clean, professional, and it almost looks like a Polaroid. I love teaching landscapes to my students, and I think ink is the perfect material. Landscapes can be super complicated and confusing, and using ink gives you vivid results without having to rely on color, which makes everything more confusing. Let's speed up the taping here since I'm repeating my steps. You'll need India ink, of course, a paint palette or something where you can mix each of your values, and a set of brushes. And which brushes you use depends on you. I tend to use the small round brush quite a lot, but with a landscape, you also want some larger brushes too. Now, although this is very beginner friendly, having a value scale baseline of knowledge is going to help you get the results you want. So if you would like a tutorial on that, click the link above. With a larger brush, even though it's still pretty small, I'm adding a bunch of water to the well next to my ink. And you can see it's already getting ink mixed in there, so a clean palette is the best way to go. But what I'm doing here is mixing my lightest value, light gray. Yep, testing it there. And this lightest value is going to be the horizon line. And the horizon line needs to be the lightest part of your landscape. Now that I have one that will stand out against the white but is light, let's paint that horizon line where the sky meets the land. I'm going to do two overlapping sections here. You could do a mountain range with layer after layer of mountains. You could keep it flat like Kansas, but I would like to do kind of the lightest gray and then light gray, two overlapping almost hill type sections. So I'm going to add just a little bit of ink here, and I'm going to cut across. I want it light, but I want it dark enough that it shows up and looks like it's getting darker as it goes towards the edge of the paper or towards the foreground. So this artwork is all about the parts of the landscape and all about atmospheric perspective. I'm going to use my bigger brush here to spread it out. And again, this could be overlapping mountain ranges. Just keep your shapes organic. Avoid anything that looks too perfect, too rounded, too detailed. Now we're going to make a medium, or more like a light medium value here. We do want it to stand out from that gray that we just created, so I want it to be a little bit more of a medium gray. This is going to be the middle ground. That's the part of the landscape that, as it sounds, it's in the middle. It's not in the background, the horizon line, it's getting closer to the front, and there's going to be a little bit more detail, and following the rules of atmospheric perspective, it would also be a little bit darker. It's still pretty far away, so we're going to stay in the medium, middle part of our value scale, and we're going to reserve our darkest values for the very front. So you can see I'm kind of tapping my brush into an area and then dragging it with the larger brush, keeping organic shapes, and I am going for a horizontal brush stroke here. So it's as if we are kind of in the valley and there's two hills. And again, you could do a mountain even farther in the distance, but I'm trying to keep mine a little bit more minimalistic. So I'm going to make an even darker gray here. And by darker gray, I still mean medium gray because I'm going to tone it down with my brush. And I'm going to blot with my paper towel. But do you see how it's bleeding and the ink is dragging it up, creating a really nice texture, perfect for a landscape. And I'm adding just a little bit of ink as I go forward, creating depth, focusing on that atmospheric perspective and making sure my middle ground stays medium gray. Nothing in nature would be black from this distance. We're talking, if we're standing in the foreground, this is what, like a mile away. We can see it, but we can't see all the detail. It's going to be, if it were color, that would be less saturated. There's less detail and everything is lighter in value. So you can see as I'm going towards the foreground, which we're not quite there yet, I'm allowing the blooms of India ink to become a little bit more large and a little bit more dark. Tapping that in there to really create that depth as if these are trees or bushes that are really far away. Now that we've established our middle ground, I like to put a body of water separating the foreground and the middle ground, taking a really light gray. You can see I'm mixing just a little bit of ink here. I'm going to do a diagonal brush swipe, leaving it white, and that's going to be the perfect section for our foreground. Finally, we can use our darkest gray, and we're going to use black, but not yet. And so I'm just going to use a big brush to kind of map this in. It will need to be darker. You can see it's the same value as the middle ground, but that just lets our eye know where it's going to be. And I started with the smooth brush stroke to apply some ink and water to the page. Now I'm taking a darker gray and I'm tapping that and letting it bloom and create an interesting texture as it interacts. Remember to keep everything organic. Nothing should be perfect. It shouldn't look like one of those games on The Sims where everything's blocked out perfectly. And it's okay to let your water kind of make some decisions for you. It'll let you know areas that are going to have more texture and that might have like a darker area to it just based on how you apply the ink. Going back to our body of water here, I'm just going to tap in a little bit of gray as I build up the darks in the front, making sure that I am focusing on the darkest values in the foreground. And the foreground's the part of the artwork closest to the viewer. If we were standing here, we'd be standing in the foreground looking out at the beautiful hills and the beautiful body of water. You can see I'm taking my time focusing on texture. I'm not just doing smooth because there's going to be more detail in the foreground. With my brush, I'm using what I call dirty paint water gray, the lightest gray possible. I'm just putting a few brush strokes to show movement in the water. Less is more when it comes to a minimalistic landscape like this. Then I'm dragging a shish kebab stick, which is kind of a strange material, to give the water just a little bit of detail. And again, I'm not drawing waves. I'm not drawing perfect lines. I'm trying to keep things loose and organic and simple. Now what I'm going to do is think about where to put some trees. So a foreground tree is going to be tall. So I'm going to start at the top here and it's going to go all the way to my horizon line. And I'm going to dab a texture across my page using a medium gray. Don't start with black. It gives you no other place to go. I want a full range of value, not just in the landscape itself, but in the trees. If you've never painted a tree before, check out this tutorial and it will show you through my strategies of using India ink to create beautiful, simple trees. When teaching this to my students, we actually spent 3 entire class periods practicing a tree. So if you're doing this at home or doing this in a classroom, make sure to practice so that you really understand the style of tree, because nothing's worse than making a landscape and then putting a weird looking tree and ruining the whole thing, because there's no erasing with ink. You can see I am layering slowly. I am up to my dark gray and I'm not going to use black yet. I still want to kind of build it up. Now, middle ground trees are a horse of a different color. A middle ground tree would be medium gray and it would be a fraction of the size of the tree in the foreground, because again, this is across an entire body of water. So what I do is I look for areas that naturally look like they want to be a tree. That dabbing motion I did that created those blooms of watercolor, anything that looks like it's already kind of triangular or a little bit larger, I can just make into a tree. Let's talk about reflections. I'm going to take a lighter value and just drag a little bit of ink right underneath the tree, pulling down to mimic the reflection of the tree. Adding a little bit more detail in the foreground tree here. I'm going to finally see if I can add some black, and I'm going to put just a little bit at the edge of the foreground, keeping it organic. I don't want it to look like a straight line. And then also, I really love a dark edge. Then I'm going to sweep my clean brush and see if I can get a little bit more detail and just tidy things up a little bit in the middle ground, maybe making it a little bit darker, but then changing my mind because, again, if it's black or dark gray, it's going to flatten out the image. Atmospheric perspective is the trick where things get lighter as they go back into space. Let's do a wash, which is a large section of water, and then we're going to play around with our sky. Make sure to not cover the whole thing. You want to leave sections pure white. You can see I have kind of hovering on the horizon line and on the right-hand side. Then I'm going to take a light value and I'm going to drag it across, letting a cloud-like texture form, building up some darker and lighter areas, being very soft. There's an argument that you could stop here, There's an argument to be made that the sky could stay pure white. I like to have a dramatic sky, and I also like it to darken kind of in contrast on the left-hand side. So if I have my tree dark on the right, I like the sky to be darker on the left. It's just a kind of fun balance composition thing. Whatever you do, unless you're painting a night sky, which, is kind of different than what I'm doing here, just make sure you leave some of it white. Even if you go drastic like I just did and you add blooms of ink into your wash, just make sure that you leave some areas white. You can also use your paper towel as a way to create texture. And something that's really challenging is making sure that your horizon line and your sky has some sort of interaction. So it shouldn't have a halo around it. You can see I'm going to touch the left side of my horizon line right there. It's okay if your sky's a little bit darker than your horizon line or a little bit lighter, but think of ways that the sky and the horizon line would interact. I'm making that corner darker, trying to still leave some areas of light. You can have a full range of value just in your sky alone. And again, the sky is touching the left-hand side of the mountain. And on the right-hand side, I'm leaving it kind of white, so there's a gap where you can see the sky and the clouds, and then it's darker in that second part of the horizon line. If you don't like playing around with washes and you want to keep your sky simple, there's an argument to be made for that for sure. But I just love a sky, and I think it can make a really dynamic, really finished look to a landscape. Let it dry completely before removing your tape, and always remove your tape at a 90-degree angle. So watch how I'm taking my tape here, and then I'm pulling actually off to the side, not straight down. That'll help make sure your tape doesn't rip your paper. It still does sometimes, even with all but the best intentions. This is the most satisfying part of all. Final piece of tape here, revealing my white frame. Oops, a little bit of tear. I can fix that just by gently pulling. And voila, all done. An India ink minimalist landscape. Thank you for sticking around and making art with me. And if you're interested in more India ink tutorials, check these out. Find my website, thatartteacher.com, for all my full-length lesson plans and student examples, all for free.